going to be going through the process of how I built this steam bent Celtic knot. It starts with building a steam box out of this drain pipe. Steam bending wood requires you have the piece steaming in a steam chamber for an hour per inch of thickness. And during that time, it has to be kept off the bottom so it's not just sitting in the condensate. And I found this drain pipe at Home Depot that has holes pre-drilled in a perfect spot to build a grate later to hold stuff off the bottom. So I'm epoxying this 4-inch PVC cleanout adapter to one end of the pipe. That'll be the end that pieces go in and out of, and then steam will come in through the back. Even though they're both nominally 4 inches, the cleanout adapter is a little bit larger diameter than the pipe, so I'm just putting it on at an angle, which actually helps loading and unloading, as you'll see later. Right here I make a slight mistake. I estimate the length of the rods at 4 inches. I really should have gone closer to 4.5 inches, because 4 inches is just barely long enough to bridge the gap between the two holes. And so I have to play some games with balancing the rods so they don't fall in while I'm epoxying them up. It turned out to be 17 of these rods I needed to make for the 17 holes in the length of drain pipe. And here I am deburring them all with a drill and a hand file. This whole process took about an hour, which is just the amount of time it needs for the epoxy to cure. So then I go and try my first test fit, and I immediately realized that the rods, because of how tightly they fit in the drain pipe and the fact that they need to be at a slight angle to make it across, that there's absolutely no way that rod is going to fit in that hole, even squeezing the pipe with a clamp. So I decided to widen the holes to 5/8 with this novelty-sized 5/8 drill bit. And here I'm drilling in one hole and out the other at the same angle that the rods are going to be, which should help with alignment during assembly. The 5/8 diameter is going to cause the rods to fit a little loose and will increase the risk of them falling in. But my plan is to clamp the pipe down to the bench so it doesn't want to move, and then just carefully set them all in place. Put a piece of blue tape on the back, epoxy the fronts, and then once that epoxy is set, go back and epoxy the backs. So another thing I realized while doing this is that the pipe is covered in this thin layer of grease, and that grease caused a few of the welds to develop pinhole leaks and delaminate after a few hours of use. The chamber can still hold its temperature, so it's not a huge deal, but it means that there's condensate dripping out of more than just one place, so it's a little bit of a pain. And then after getting all the rods in place, I use any leftover epoxy and just ensure there are no gaps anywhere. And here's a look inside the pipe. You can see the rods are super well aligned. Not that flatness is critical, but it does make sliding things in a lot easier. And getting them this flat any other way would require building some kind of jig. So getting that pre-drilled drain pipe is definitely the move. And now I'm building the cap for the other end of the pipe where the steam will come in. I'm using Rockler's steam bending kit, which comes with this brass fitting for the steam hose. I bandsaw cut a circle out of a scrap piece of wood, and then I took it to the lathe to cut a slight wedge shape in it to make it press fit into the end of the pipe. I should have done the lathe work before installing the fitting because I had to get a little creative to chuck it up in the lathe without damaging the fitting. But this was still easier than taking the fitting off because of the way I had installed that, and yeah, got it done. And then I just very quickly improvised a way to hold the pipe at a 1/4 inch per foot slope by measuring between the bench legs and adding these 2x4 supports. And then I do a test fit of the cap and move on to setting up the steam box. So the first step is to remove this ridiculously oversized safety label from the power cord. And then you fill it with water and plug it in. And basically, as long as it's plugged in, it is running, and it just runs until the water is gone, and that's it. All right, and we're starting to see a little bit of steam. So without a thermometer installed, I figured that meant we were at temperature. So I went ahead and added my 3/8 inch piece of oak as a little test piece, and I let it steam for 20 minutes. And during those 20 minutes, I realized I didn't have a form ready. So I went and found, for some reason, the world's dirtiest bucket that was just in the yard of this house when I moved in, and decided to try to use that as a form. We got our stick.
Stick.
Oh, wow. It is, like, it just droops naturally.
that just looks long run. Like, that doesn't look like you should be able to do that.
Yeah. And here we are the next day, and I take the clamps off of the bucket, and the piece holds its shape pretty well. There's a little bit of spring back, which is to be expected. And I start thinking this thing has potential as some kind of musical instrument. Anyway, I decided to make a little keepsake out of it by cutting the curved part into 3 equal pieces. And I was hoping they'd be long enough to make a Celtic knot out of, but they were a little short, so I just made this little triangle instead. But for the actual Celtic knot we're going to build, we are going to need to steam bend 1.5-inch thick pieces. And with that thickness comes an additional challenge or risk of splitting. One of the interesting things about steam bending is that on the inside of the bend, the fibers can compress, but on the outside of the bend, the fibers can't stretch. So you need to build a strap clamp like I'm doing here that will basically, you cinch the piece that you're going to bend alongside that strap, and then while you bend it, the strap prevents it from getting longer, and the inside is forced to compress. So we're about to give it a try here for the first time, so if any of that was confusing, you can just hopefully see how it works. I'm yet again using a random piece of junk as a form. This is a 2-foot diameter steel hoop that I bought at this steel yard in New Jersey. And I have not a ton of confidence in this approach. I just want to see how things go. So I'm using a piece of oak that's about half heartwood and half sapwood. And the way I put it in the clamp makes it bend with the sapwood in tension, which is probably would have been better the other way. As you can start to see, the sapwood is just breaking all over the place. It's completely inflexible. The encouraging thing in this close-up you can see is that the heartwood did bend. So with the form that's easier to control and a pure heartwood piece, I think there is some potential here. So here I am building a nice form. The shape is a circle inscribed in a square, and then 3 out of the 4 corners cut off. I used a circle cutting jig on the bandsaw to make the cuts. I'm drilling these holes to act as ports for clamps. And here's my first try using it. I definitely did not think through the work holding enough. This is clamped to a table where the tabletop is not attached to the base, and the base is on casters that can't be locked. So this is just a ridiculous comedy of errors watching me try to bend this on a table that just rolls around. At this point, I realize that what I'm trying to do is impossible, so I give up and steam another piece while I figure out some better work holding. So here comes the next piece, and what I came up with for clamping the form is one of those deceptively simple clamping things where I really just have 2 dogs in the face vise, and I'm using the face vise to clamp the entire form against the wall. And so it's relying on the bench's attachment to the wall, which is pretty solid. And here's where we get our first really successful bend on a full-size piece of oak. You can see I'm adding a clamp everywhere that I can, and then at the very end here I pull it together with the big Bessie clamps, and then I just leave it overnight, and then the next day I come back and take the clamps off and have a look at it, and I can see that there's some splitting on the tension side, and I think that was actually due to the strap clamp falling off at the end that you bend it from. There's nothing preventing the end from just peeling back and taking the wood out of compression. But it turned out it was pretty easy to fix those cracks with wood filler and glue, and then I went and added a block to the clamp to prevent it from happening in the future. So at this point the experimentation phase is pretty much over, and I have a repeatable way of making this bend. I did find that having someone come behind and add clamps as I bend improves things, but otherwise basically for the next couple days I just did 1 piece a day because they take overnight to dry and I only have 1 form. And after a while I had 3 really good, mostly matching pieces that I would use to make the knot with. Including the first test piece, it took me 8 bends to get 3 that were good enough. And over doing those 8 bends, I learned a couple tricks that I'll just share with you here. First thing is that when you start the piece on the form, you have to make sure that it's flat to the bottom. Otherwise, as you bend around, it'll lift off. And even if it lifts up a little bit, that can cause it to twist. The second thing I learned is that pieces with knots, knots never bend well. Even if they're small, any variation in wood density will make it kink. So you have to choose your pieces pretty carefully. And here we are with the 3 pieces selected and sanded and all the joinery cut. I skipped about a day of work in doing all the joinery because I didn't know what I was doing, and if I had tried to film it, it probably would have made it take twice as long. But basically what I did is I traced the 3 pieces onto giant sheets of paper, and I cut them out. And then I aligned the paper cutouts to each other and marked all the crossings for all the joinery, making note of the ups and the downs. And then I taped the templates back onto the wood and made all the appropriate cuts. And thank God they all fit together. Then I just fine-tuned all of the joints so that they can kind of twist together. And for assembly, I'm only gluing the ends together. Because I left the centers proud, what that does is it actually leaves the ends in tension. So you have to like bend them for them to touch each other. And because of that tension, I'm adding a brass rod along with the glue, just as double insurance. And then for a finish coat, I'm just using boiled linseed oil. And that's it. Thanks for watching.